All right, so let's dive into the nitty gritty. The 1, 2, 3 inning. Our first out. Negro League statistics are now being counted within the Major League Baseball database. They're entering into the record books. What does that mean? So, and also, that's also not the only element of this. Negro League families are now getting Major League Baseball benefits from the last thing I read as well. They are now being entered into the pension system and all of that stuff, which is
awesome.
I think phenomenal. It's absolutely fantastic. So, but as far as statistically speaking, I think that at this point, right, with how seriously baseball takes stats, right, baseball stats, I think in a way are kind of sacred. It is it gets taken pretty seriously. So right now, Josh Gibson, who the maybe the best Negro League player of all time, former catcher, 372 batting average, now the all-time leader. I believe he is now also the all-time leader in OPS. Yes, he is. He's the all-time leader in slugging. It changes a lot of things in the record book. So it brings up a big debate piece because obviously, again, under the circumstances, it's very, very hard to compare eras, and it's very already it really was. But I kind of just want to get your thoughts on this. What did you make of this whole announcement? It kind of came out of nowhere, right? Because the Major League Baseball acknowledged the Negro Leagues, or at least some of the Negro Leagues, as professional Major League Baseball leagues back in 2020. And this is now 4 years later, and we're getting this sort of this story coming up now. I kind of found it as a bit of a surprise. So what do you make of this whole thing, Dalton? Kind of lead us off here.
I mean, so this type of statistical integration is never going to be perfectly smooth. And I think speaking at least for myself, that's fine. Look, there are going to be people out there who are going to point at some of these statistical leaderboards and say, well, they're not playing seasons that were as long, right? And therefore putting up these stats over a season or putting up these stats over a career, the sample sizes are different, and so it needs an asterisk and blah blah blah. Look, listen, it's not perfect, especially when we're talking about rate stats. I get it, but at the same time, we are not, any of us, in a position to sit here and act as if we think things are perfect from the 30s and 40s and 20s in Major League Baseball either, right? So at the end of the day, we already look at stats from that era with a little bit of a grain of salt, right? We literally have an era in baseball that we call the dead ball era. So this idea that Josh Gibson taking over spots at the top of the leaderboard being something that needs an asterisk or isn't deserved in some capacity. Who are we to suggest that the Negro League was any less than the majors during those times? We don't know. And at the end of the day, what matters most is that the representation is happening now, right? To me, the positives that come from that representation, that comes from the pension stuff you were mentioning, right? The number of people who had never heard of Josh Gibson before 2 days ago that are now landing on his baseball reference page, right? And reading about him and what a great player he was. That's a good thing. And any negatives that we're concerned about from a statistical standpoint, I think there's some debate to be had there and fine, but it's just not where the conversation needs to be right now. The conversation right now should be, hey, what an awesome opportunity to celebrate guys like Gibson, Oscar Charleston, Buck Leonard, Judd Wilson, all these guys, right? It's a cool thing that we're able to celebrate that now, and I think that's where the focus should really be right now.
Yeah. So here's the thing, and I've since yesterday, I've really kind of thought about this relatively heavily, right? And one of the things that you bring up is pretty interesting because, for a baseball junkie like myself, I knew who Josh Gibson was, but I also didn't know the extent of Negro League baseball. I never really took the effort into looking into Negro League baseball until yesterday. I just didn't, because it never occurred to me. My thought didn't, the thoughts in my head did not go that deep, simply. You are right. I think in the grand scheme of things, does it necessarily matter in that much of a capacity? No, it doesn't. And to be honest, I think it matters to a point where, like, okay, is having Josh Gibson ahead of Ty Cobb now as an all-time leading player, despite the fact that he played 2,500 less games. Like, there are definitely going to be people that say, like, yeah, there's going to be an asterisk next to that. And that was one of the things that I've been talking about with a few buddies of mine. I mean, our guy, Barry Grant Jr., I had a conversation with him earlier today, and it was more of a debate of, like, does it create more problems than it solves, right? Because I've always kind of, looked at, and I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say I've always looked at it, but whenever it gets brought up to me, Negro League baseball players were in a way in themselves like mythical, right? Because what they were is that as they were excluded, as rooted in evil as it was, they've been excluded from Major League Baseball. And kind of the way that those stories were told about Negro League baseball players were like, oh man, did you look at Josh Gibson and how, like, man, if he played Major League Baseball for 20 years, man, he would have hit whatever, 700 home runs, and he would have been one of the all-time greats, and he would have been all this. And listen, again, there can be a debate about that no matter what. But now it also kind of like brings up the question of, like, now when people look at Josh Gibson and people like Josh Gibson, right? Oscar Charleston, whoever else, like, is it better for them to be, or is it better, I guess, better for the whole conversation for them to be recognized in the stat books, but maybe with an asterisk next to their name, right? Like, is that actually better for the conversation? Like, do you kind of get what I'm saying here?
I just like, to me, if you're going to put an asterisk on Negro League statistics because of number of games played, like I understand the thought process, like I can follow it. But I just think that, like, if that's where we're going to start putting asterisks, then there are a lot of other places that you could make a similar
Oh
argument
yeah,
for asterisks, right?
certainly.
Like, you could all, like given what we saw, like there were guys who came over from the Negro Leagues and dominated, right? I mean, some of the
Oh yeah.
biggest names in baseball history. And so if we're going to put asterisks on the Negro Leagues, then we should put asterisks on Major League Baseball pre-integration too, right? Like,
Mhm.
to me, the whole thing, like turning it into to a debate, like, is just kind of not the direction that I look at it.
Mhm.
I look at it as one of those things that it's just like, okay, awesome, yeah, it messes with the leaderboards a little bit. Like, people are going to know who the Negro League guys are and who the Major League guys are, and it can create some fun conversation of, like, man, like, I wonder, like, if we gotten to see Gibson and Cobb on the same field, like, what would that have looked like, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
I think it's fun to imagine these things, and I think at the end of the day, man, we're talking about baseball statistics from between 1920 and 1950. Like, we don't take those that seriously to begin with. So,
It's true.
like, in that sense, like, there's no, like, I can't. I'll put it this way: I can't think of a real downside to it. Like,
Mhm.
it's more inclusive. It adds more history to our game, right, and more to learn
Yeah.
about our game. It's, I just don't see it as anything more than a good thing.
Yeah. No, and I think most of the people that are going to disagree, right? And like I said, when this first came out, I'll be honest, my initial reaction was, well, that doesn't really seem right, right? Because, like, it just, like, yeah, obviously, given the circumstances, like I said, but my initial reaction was, but they never played in the like, do you know what I mean? Like, it just, my initial reaction was that. But again, I'm kind of falling in line a little bit with you in a sense of, like, all right, like, really, what is there to really be upset about? Because again, like, you bring up a very, very, very good point, and it was something that I was going to bring up if you didn't, was we already in sports, not even just baseball, just
Right.
in sports, struggle so mightily to compare numbers cross generationally, right? But, like, people, like, believe it or not, right? Like, comparing LeBron versus Jordan is cross generational. The sports were different, right? And especially, I mean, it might be even more so. It might be the most so in baseball, because nothing could be more different than baseball in 2020 and baseball in 1920, where the ball was different, the fields were different, like everything was different. You
Like,
know,
look, if you dropped Patrick Corbin onto the field in 1935, like he might be the best pitcher in baseball.
right? Well,
I
yeah, and
mean,
maybe,
we don't know, right? But like the point I'm trying to make is I think all of the evidence that we have, and this is not just baseball, this is across sports,
mm,
is that we are getting better at building our athletes. We're getting better, like the science of it, the coaching of it, the perfection of the equipment, right? Like human beings are getting bigger and stronger with time. We always have,
yeah,
and so like to me, comparing era versus era has always been kind of a silly thing, and I think everything in order to be understood needs to be viewed within its context. And that even goes for Jordan and LeBron, right? I mean,
yeah,
the game was played differently in those eras. The athletes were different in those eras, right?
yeah, right,
And so that's yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of on the same page in that sense. Where like for me, it's just like, well, we already don't like if you were to ask me who's the best baseball player I've ever seen play the game,
yeah,
it's got for me it's got to be a modern guy if we're trying to be like perfectly technical about it, right? I mean, like if you put him on the field, who's the best player? It's gonna be Trout, Otani,
it's
right? Somebody
Tommy Otani,
like
yeah, right, exactly,
but there's no point in viewing things that way because if you view things that way, it's only whoever the most recent guy is. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
right,
So in
right,
that sense, I think it's fun to add this stuff into the record book, right? It's an opportunity for us to learn more about
mhm.
guys like Josh, like Josh Gibson, right? I mean, it's an opportunity for us to acknowledge more of history, and yeah, I'm excited about it. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, I'm not, as I've kind of had time to think about it, I'm just kind of finding myself like, I don't really, I don't want to like, I don't think saying that I don't care is the right phrase, but you kind of get what I'm saying. Like, I don't necessarily have like a deep rooted problem with it. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that like Negro League stats back then were not kept to the same degree of what Major League stats were. So, like, regardless of the amount of research, this is one of the things that I kind of just don't buy mostly is that I don't know that all of these numbers are really all that accurate, but like that's really kind of what I'm getting because if you're getting most of your stuff from like old newspaper scraps and stuff like that, and that's really where you're finding most of this stuff because you're finding incomplete box scores for games and which games were official and which ones weren't and all of that stuff. I feel like it could be very, very hard. But at the same time, you're also looking at Major League Baseball that's probably been doing this research for 25 years and, you know, really trying to piece it all together. Um, but yeah, so that's the big story right now in Major League Baseball, and um, a lot of people, I'm sure, are going to look at it positively. I'm sure a lot of people are going to get all up and tight about it and look at it in a negative light. So again,
I'll put
we'll
it this
see.
way: anything that brings Turkey Stearns, who won a quadruple crown in the Negro Leagues, which is incredible, right? Anybody who and by that I mean he led the league in doubles, triples, home runs, and stolen bases. Like anything that brings him, he also worked in a grocery store. He was nicknamed Turkey because he would run around while puffing his chest out, and that was kind of like a just kind of part of how he looked as a player. And like,
Mhm.
what a cool player to learn about, right? Like
Yeah,
the number of stories that are being read about these guys right now, like to me, I'm like you're not saying anything that I think is absurd, right? Or that
yeah,
I like super vehemently disagree with. I just think that this stuff's so cool and it kind of outweighs it.
yeah,
That's all.
yeah. No, and really, I think the root of my distaste for this subject or where this subject is that like I just see so many people on Twitter and stuff like that are saying like, I saw this tweet from Dan Clark where it was like if you have any problem with this, you're just being a racist and that's simple. And it's that simple. I'm like, well just hold on a minute. I'm like, can we not like that? I think is really the big problem of a lot of these conversations is the overwhelming, like overreaction of like, I'm set in my opinion, and that's just that. Right. Like I can't wrap my head around, like, yeah, certainly there are going to be people out there that are not going to like this because of reasons that we don't really want to air out on air. But I would argue that probably most people don't have an issue with this for a lot of the reasons that I described. And it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, look, I think the reality is that, like, while there are a lot of people like you, Mike, there are also a lot of people out there who, like, genuinely are a little bit nefarious and having an issue with it.
Probably.
So, like, to me, parsing out who's who, man, I would just rather learn about these dudes, man.
Yeah.
I would just rather learn about these dudes. Like, it's a cool thing. So,
That's
but
fine.
I hear you.
So our buddy Bryson Carver comes in on this. Y'all hit on some great points regarding how we view players from past eras, particularly pre-1970. To me, the best part of this is convos about those players as well as American history as a whole. Bryson's a massive history buff. As we know it, he was doing shows, podcasts on presidents, however long ago, a year or two ago. More than anything, we get education on the past, and I think that's always a good thing. Again, a lot of what you're talking about there